Thank you. You know, it's interesting. I'd never seen Dan Patterson before, but having seen him now, I realized that we were probably divided at birth. Although I suspect he's a little bit shorter than I am. You know, I was given a simple task tonight. I was told I have 25 minutes, and I should explain everything that's going on in the Middle East, Egypt, Iran, Syria, the peace process, and, you know, lay it out there. So I began to think about, you know, how can one capture a moment like this? You know, too, you heard a little bit about my resume. What you didn't hear is I was the political appointee for two Republican presidents, President Reagan and the first President Bush, and President Bill Clinton and President Obama, which in many respects, when you think about Washington today and you think about what's going on, it probably makes me pretty much of an extinct species. But when you think about each of those administrations, if you looked at the Middle East, and I can tell you in each of those administrations, we had a crisis that involved the Middle East, in every one of them. But it was always one crisis. If you looked at any of those administrations, any of those presidents, if what they had to deal with was only Egypt today, it would have been enough. If it was only Syria today, it would be enough. If it was only Iran, it would be enough. And if it was only the Israelis and the Palestinians, it would be enough. But it has to deal, and we collectively have to deal with all of them. So as I thought, all right, so how do I create a perspective for you about the region? How can you understand it? And a story occurred to me. In 2007, I was asked by Vanity Fair to respond to the T.E. Lawrence of Arabia's map that he prepared for the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Now, his map was not the equivalent of the Sykes-Picot map. His map was shaped by a Middle East that he wanted built around sectarian, tribal, clannish identities. He thought that if you built states on that basis, those states would be stable. So I was asked to take a look at the map, and I'm going to try to visualize this for you, so bear with me as I do it. If you looked at what is today the northern part of Iran, the southern part of Turkey, the northern part of Iraq, and the northeastern part of Syria, he had a Kurdish area. That was going to be a state. If you look at the area from Iraq down the Persian Gulf, through Kuwait, Bahrain, the Emirates, and so forth, that was going to be Shia. From the center part of Iraq to the south, into Saudi Arabia, that was going to be Sunni. To the west in Saudi Arabia, from the Hejaz and then north up into Jordan, it was Sunni, but it was going to be connected by a series of tribes. In fact, if you saw the movie Lawrence of Arabia, all the tribes in that area, in the Aqaba area to the north and to the south and to the Hejaz, and actually stretching into the Sinai, those were going to be connected in a state. In Palestine, he had a place for a Jewish state. In Lebanon, built around Mount Lebanon, he built a Christian state. And then in what was part of Syria, you had what was a combination of different groups to create yet another state. So 2007, imagine, I'm asked this question. Can you look at that map and do you think it has a logic? And I said, well, yes, it has a logic. But if you're asking me in the Middle East of 2007, leaving aside Iraq, given what was going on in Iraq at the time, you know, you have authoritarian regimes that are in control, and the states that exist have developed an identity under that kind of authoritarian hand. So imagine, let's say they came to me right now, and they said, take a look at that map. What do you think I would say? What would be my response today? It's a rhetorical question. I would say, you know, there's a lot more logic there, and there's a lot more reality there than I thought before. Look at Syria today. I think the odds of Syria remaining a unified state over the future is quite limited. You know, the war in Syria is spilling over into Iraq. I don't know if we're going to see a unified Iraq over time. Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. What we've seen since the Iraq War, what we've seen with the Arab awakening, was the removal of authoritarian regimes, and in their place was a vacuum. And it's not a surprise that that vacuum has been filled in the first instance by very basic fundamental identities. That's what people connect to. That's what they feel rooted in. And so what you see today is a conflict in Syria that is sectarian, a Sunni-Shia divide, but it's more than that because the Alawis, the Druze, the Kurds, they're all, in a sense, rooted in a highly localized conflict. You're seeing, as I said, you see it spill over into Iraq. You see it in Lebanon increasingly. On the one hand, this emergence of a vacuum is being filled by sectarian identities. If you look at Egypt, that doesn't explain Egypt because Egypt is 90% Sunni, 10% Coptic Christian. The divide in Egypt is still a divide over identity, but it's a divide over a national identity. The big mistake of the Muslim Brotherhood, among others, the big mistake was they challenged Egypt's national identity. It's deeply rooted. They alienated the majority of the Egyptian population because they sought an Islamist identity over a nationalist identity. They sought to promote only the Muslim Brotherhood. They weren't inclusive. They sought control over governance. And it backfired. It produced what amounted to a popular recall, a popular revolution. Now, one of the reasons it produced that was not simply because they weren't respecting the long-standing Egyptian national identity. It's also that they ignored what has been what drove the Arab awakening. Look at all the non-monarchies. What emerged in those countries in the Middle East was an image of people seeing themselves as citizens and not as subjects. As citizens, they could make demands. As subject, it was the regime that imposed demands on them. As citizens, they had a voice. The regime, as subject, it was the regime who basically required them to listen. It had the voice. As citizens, they could have hopes and expectations and a sense of possibility. As subjects, it was the regime that defined their possibility. And as citizens, they saw themselves creating accountability. And as subjects, it was the regime that held them accountable. While all that is highly desirable and hopeful and created a sense of possibility, the problem was the institutions for accountability don't exist. So in this vacuum, in the context that was created, in the chaos that emerged, now you have a struggle. You have a struggle for identity. You have a struggle for how to create accountability. You have a struggle to become citizens. And what it says about the Middle East is that this is a struggle that will take us through the next, I would say, at least 10 to the next 20 years. This is going to be a region characterized by turmoil and upheaval. It's not going to be a region that's characterized by stability. Okay, so there, I've set a context for you. So now, in my remaining time, let me say something about Egypt, quickly, Syria, Iran, and the issue that usually I talk about because I'm incapable of not talking about it, which is a peace issue. Egypt. Egypt obviously is critical to the region. It's the largest Arab country. When people used to ask me, what's the mood on the Arab street, I'd say, what's the mood in Egypt? It's usually half the Arab street. The Egyptian military is capitalizing on what I was describing before. It is capitalizing on the popular revulsion at the Muslim Brotherhood. Today, what it does has enormous popular backing. The real question for the military is, will they learn from the mistakes of the Muslim Brotherhood? Not in terms of playing upon a national identity. That they do naturally. That's what defines them. They're the embodiment of Egyptian patriotism. No, the question is, will they learn that the answer for them is to produce governance and not control? If they begin to focus more on governance, if they empower the interim government, if they focus on developing the civil institutions in society, then they have a chance, actually, to transform Egypt and transform Egypt for the better. Today, they count on the support they get from the Gulf states. You look at a country like Saudi Arabia defines its priorities as Iran, countering and competing with Iran on the one hand, and stopping the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood on the other. So they compete with the Iranians in the conflict within Syria, the focal point of the Sunni-Shia divide, and they back the Egyptian military in Egypt because of what they do to suppress the Muslim Brotherhood. But will the Saudis want to be the Egyptian banker forever? Or will they want there to be investment from the outside, tourism to return? And I think the answer is self-evident. And for us, we should recognize fundamentally we have a stake in Egypt being a success. The last thing we want to see is Egypt become a failed state. That's a collective interest that we have. It's important to us, the United States, to the British, to the West. It's important to Israel. This is something that we need to be focusing on, not cutting off the Egyptians right now, which would produce a backlash against us, but focusing on how we can get the Egyptian military and the interim government to focus on what they need, to be smart about it. All right, what about Syria? We've seen this chemical weapons resolution adopted. We're going to see, starting next week, what will probably be the beginning of the destruction of the equipment that mixes the chemicals. Realize that 70% of the chemical weapons or the stocks that are in Syria today require mixing. So when you destroy the equipment that mixes the chemicals, you're doing away with 70% of being able to turn those stocks into weapons. That's an important achievement. We'll have to see what Assad does over time. I assume that Assad over time will begin to play cat and mouse games just the way Saddam Hussein did. But if, in fact, you actually can eliminate the chemical weapons, that will be a very positive thing. From an Israeli standpoint, it removes a strategic threat that Syria poses to Israel. But of course, it doesn't end the war within Syria. There's a paradox here. On the one hand, we brand Assad a war criminal. On the other hand, he's a legitimate partner for carrying out this process of the destruction of chemical weapons. While I would very much like to see this process of destroying the chemical weapons, in a sense, merge into or evolve into a political process to produce an outcome in Syria, I don't have high expectations that'll be the case. I don't see the opposition in Syria suddenly deciding that they're prepared to seriously negotiate if Assad is going to stay in power. Assad remains a magnet for attracting jihadis from all over the world. And if we want to see a political outcome in Syria, the only way to produce it is by ensuring that, in fact, he goes. And the only way that's going to happen is if you change the balance of power on the ground. Unless we get really serious about providing lethal assistance in a highly coordinated fashion, unless we focus very heavily on changing the balance of power, not only between the opposition and the regime, but within the opposition itself, the prospect of producing a political outcome that is for the better, I think, remains slim. If that isn't possible, we have to think very hard about an objective of containment. The one thing, we have a saying in the States about the Las Vegas rules. Have you heard the Las Vegas rules? What's done in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas? Well, unfortunately, the Las Vegas rules don't apply to Syria. What takes place in Syria isn't going to stay in Syria. That's why you see the spillover to Iraq. That's why you see the spillover to Lebanon. That's why you see the spillover to Turkey. Jordan has absorbed 600,000 refugees. It puts enormous pressure on Jordan. We need to find a way, if you can't produce a political outcome in Syria, to at least contain this conflict so it doesn't metastasize and threaten the whole area around it. All right, what about Iran? There is a charm offensive underway right now. How to think about President Rouhani? Is the issue that there should have been a handshake, or the fact that there's been a phone call, which is a symbol of breaking down barriers? That's all positive, potentially. But does it really tell us anything? Does it really translate into anything? The short answer is nobody can tell you that right now. You can look at President Rouhani's election, and it's meaningful, even though there were only 6 candidates permitted, meaning they all had to fit a certain criteria. The reality is he ran against the policies that produced the sanctions. He ran against the policies that produced international isolation. Once he became president, he said the economy was even worse than he thought it was. He has continued to put a premium on being able to remove the sanctions for the sake of the Iranian economy. And there's a simple fact here. The sanctions are not going to be removed unless they change the character of their nuclear program. Smiles, nice words are not going to end the sanctions. But if there's a readiness to negotiate a real change to the character of their program, meaning that they cannot have what's known as a breakout capability, meaning they can have civil nuclear power, but they can't have civil nuclear power in a way that allows them, at a moment of their choosing, to turn it into nuclear weapons. They can't have it in a way that would allow them to escape our detection in time to prevent them from turning it into nuclear weapons. The key for us now is to test what clearly is an interest that the Iranians have in a deal, because after all, the supreme leader allowed Rouhani to win, even though, as I said, he ran against the policies that created the current circumstances that Iran finds itself in. Now, that at least suggests they have an interest in a deal. What it doesn't tell us is whether or not it's a deal that we can live with. It doesn't tell us whether or not Rouhani in the end can deliver on a deal he might want to negotiate. The only way to know that is not to assume it. The only way to know that is to, in a sense, test it. I would like to see us do one thing. I would like us, at least in private, from the U.S. standpoint, to become more clear in terms of stating, at least privately. You don't have to say it publicly. You don't have to trap us. You don't have to put the Iranians in a corner. But at least privately say, what's the point at which the development within the Iranian nuclear program goes so far that even the United States can't ensure that it can fulfill the objective that President Obama has identified, which is the prevention of Iran having a nuclear weapon, not the containment of it after the fact. There will come a point where the number of centrifuges they have, the hardening of their facilities, the accumulated enriched uranium, the combination of all of these things, plus their development of a heavy water plant, could put them at a point where they could move faster than we could detect it and then act against it. When we reach that point, the objective of prevention loses its meaning. We should be prepared, at least in private, to say, we're watching. The window for diplomacy is there, but if we see you approaching that point and the diplomacy hasn't produced, then you need to understand we will do whatever it takes, including military action, to ensure that the objective of prevention is fulfilled. I suggest to you that if we did that, A, it would reassure the Israelis, they wouldn't feel the need to have to act themselves militarily, and B, it would signal the Iranians that there is no way other than through diplomacy for them, A, to reduce the sanctions, and B, to avoid the use of military force against their nuclear program. If that were to happen, I would suggest to you that that increases the prospect that diplomacy will actually work. All right, can diplomacy work between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Good question. You know, we've just celebrated the 20th anniversary of Oslo. So we've spent 20 years trying to see if we can negotiate a real peace between Israelis and Palestinians, a real two-state solution. There have been achievements, but obviously we're not close to where the people who conceived of Oslo thought we would be at this point. In some ways, we have an interesting paradox today. The very upheaval that I've been talking about, the causes of it I've been describing, that very upheaval has produced something very interesting. I described earlier how the Saudis focus on what are their main preoccupations, meaning Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. Did I say the peace issue? Did I say the Palestinians? No, you didn't miss anything. That's not their focus. You look at this region today, what is everybody consumed with? What is everybody preoccupied with? It's Iran, it's Syria, it's Egypt, but not the Israeli-Palestinian issue. The paradox is when no one, or those in the region are not preoccupied with it, it actually creates a space. It creates a political space to do something about it. Abu Mazen is better positioned today to do something on peace, first because the rest of the region isn't preoccupied and might produce a backlash against him. Second, because of what happened in Egypt, the Hamas has been dramatically weakened. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, In my mind, he's absolutely serious about wanting to do a deal. Why do I say that? Because since a year ago, June, he has said repeatedly, publicly and repeatedly, Israel will not become a binational state. Now think about what that means. When he says Israel will not become a binational state, he is recognizing demographic realities, and he's saying something else. To do nothing would produce Israel as a binational state, and he says we will not let that happen. So there's a context where the rest of the region is preoccupied, which creates political space, and there's a need. I think if Abu Mazen wants to have a legacy, he's 80 years old, if he wants to have a legacy of being the Palestinian leader who produced a Palestinian state, this is his moment. The Prime Minister of Israel is making it very clear that he will not allow Israel to become a binational state, meaning he will ensure that the Zionist dream is fulfilled, and the essence of that is to be a Jewish democratic state. That creates the context. Now that's the good news. What's the bad news? I should tell you that whenever I come home, I see my wife and I say, I have good news and bad news. She never asks me for the good news first. She always says, what's the bad news? Right? I started with the good news. What's the bad news? The bad news is that there is profound disbelief. You look at the polling among Israelis and Palestinians, and it's a mirror image. You will find 70 to 80% of the Israeli public and the Palestinian public will say they want a two-state outcome, with everything that's happened. And the same percentage will say they don't believe it will ever happen. Now, when you have a context of disbelief, it's very difficult to negotiate a solution to this problem that requires taking on history and mythology. It's difficult for leaders if they know their publics, in a sense, are disbelieving. It's difficult for the leaders themselves, even if they want it, because the issues on which they have to resolve this conflict, the core issues of borders and security and refugees in Jerusalem, it's very difficult to bridge the gaps between them and those issues when they themselves share in that disbelief. So my suggestion for how to try to affect this, to give them a reason to think that in fact the positions that they have or the gaps that exist on those core issues might be overcome, is to try to address the sources of disbelief on each side about the other's commitment to two states. Now, I actually have a 16-point agenda for their discussion, and though I would be happy to run through the 16 points, I'm going to spare you that. But I want to give you some illustrative examples of what I mean. And what I'm suggesting here is not about unilateral steps. The only thing we've seen that unilateral steps produce is more unilateralism. We need mutuality. We don't need unilateralism. Palestinians will ask the question, why do they doubt that Israel believes in two states? Because they say, if Israel believed in two states, why are they building in what should be our state? Or they'll say, if Israel believed in two states, why don't, in fact, they create much more space for our own activity? Why do they control so much of our lives? So, two suggestions for the Israelis to be prepared to discuss with the Palestinians if there were a parallel step on the other side are, one, build only in the blocks, not outside the blocks. The blocks constitute about 8% of the West Bank. They're to the west of where the separation barrier is. So if you're building only in the 8%, that means that there's about 92% of the West Bank that you wouldn't be building in. And Israel would be saying, we're not going to build in what we think will be your state. We're only going to build in what we think should be our state. And the Palestinians might say, well, the blocks are too large. Okay, you'll negotiate the size of the blocks. That's how you're going to come, blocks and swaps, that's how you're going to come to borders. So Israel will be only building in what they think should be part of Israel. You want the blocks to be smaller? Negotiate over it. A second step that the Israelis could contemplate, Area C represents 60% of the West Bank. Area C is where the Israelis retain responsibility for civil and security. Now, if you were to open up Area C to economic activity for the Palestinians, it would, I shouldn't say C and A, but in the first instance, what it would do is it would be good for the Palestinians from an economic sense, but it would also send a message that Israel is serious when it says, we don't want to control you. We don't want to occupy you. Something, by the way, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly said. But those words would ring much more true with Palestinians if you would open up Area C to economic activity, which wouldn't threaten Israel from a security standpoint. So there's just two examples on the Israeli side. What about on the Palestinian side? Well, I'll give you two examples to stand out. Again, to discuss with the Israelis. First, how about putting Israel on a map? You want to convince the Israeli public that, in fact, you're serious about two states? You want to address the Israeli perception that you aren't really prepared to accept a two-state outcome, a genuine two-state outcome? Put Israel on a map. I once asked one of the Palestinian negotiators, why isn't Israel on a map? And he said, well, because we don't know what the borders would be. I said, you know what you want them to be? Put Israel on a map. Be prepared to put Israel on a map. A second step. You know, Yasser Arafat used to say to me all the time, he said, I'm not asking for the moon. Well, I'm not asking for the moon right now. Arafat used to also use a phrase with me and with others. He used to always talk about the peace of the brave. Take Arafat's mantra of the peace of the brave and prepare your public for peace, something that isn't done today. And I'm not asking for the moon, as I said. How to prepare your public for peace? How about you start by saying both sides have hard decisions to make, not only Israel. Both sides. These are historic decisions that have to be made, and both sides have them to make. You know, I could give you all sorts of other examples that would amplify these kinds of moves that are designed to address the sources of doubt on each side. But if this set of discussions could parallel what is going on at the negotiations now, it would create momentum in the negotiations. One of the problems, because we're in the 20th year of Oslo, is that you're not going to convince the Israeli public or the Palestinian public unless you can show them that something is different this time. And they're not seeing something is different this time. They have to see something is different this time. There can be public messaging where each side actually acknowledges that the other does something positive, something that isn't done today. But if you don't begin to demonstrate that something is different this time, you not only won't deal with the sources of disbelief outside of the negotiating table with the publics, you'll have a hard time creating the momentum within the negotiations to take on the gaps that exist between the two sides on the core issues. All right, so there's a suggestion for how to deal with the peace issue. In a context where I said it's not hopeless, let me conclude with one broad thought about Israel. And actually, Daniel Taub said this earlier. It is remarkable when you look at this region, what's going on. Now, I said to you, it's going to go on for the next 10 to 20 years. And for all I know, that could actually be an optimistic assessment, because we're dealing with these core questions of identity and building institutions to deal with that, and building a political culture where the idea of mutual adjustment has to become embedded, where the idea of tolerance for the other has to become part of the landscape. By the way, I'm talking right now about with only Arab countries. I'm not even talking about the Arabs in Israel. That takes time to build. During this period of turmoil, what's the one country that isn't characterized by instability? What's the one country that you can count on being consistent in terms of its outlook? What's the one country that is based on a rule of law and a separation of powers? What's the one country that embodies a set of liberal democratic values? It's Israel. And Israel's not going to change. And our stake in Israel isn't going to change. And Israel will also continue to be increasingly at the center of Jewish life. I watched the film tonight, and I listened to the reasons that the people who are being interviewed for why they feel the attachment to Israel. Why is Israel so important? Well, Israel is important to the diaspora because it does help to define and inspire and help to create the sense of continuity in Jewish life. But the diaspora is important to Israel as well, because at the very moment we have all this turmoil in the region, at the very moment where we can see more than 100,000 people killed in Syria, and that number is probably low. More than a third of Syria's population of 21 million displaced, either internally or externally. At the very moment where that can go on, where chemical weapons can be used, there is a parallel move to delegitimize Israel. It's unthinkable, and it should be incomprehensible. And all of us who are part of the diaspora have our own responsibility to confront it. Thank you very much.